Good evening, and welcome to the third session of our Foundation Year program. Over the last 2 weeks, under the guidance of Dr. Carmen Palmer, we've been looking at some of the earliest formative literature in the Western tradition, in the form of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the stories of Genesis and Exodus in the Old Testament. It makes sense then that this week we should move on to another epic tale, filled with some of the greatest characters, creatures, monsters, and events ever conceived. That is, of course, the Odyssey by Homer. Here to lead us in our discussion of the Odyssey and to get us thinking more broadly about myth and its fundamental role in shaping the Western literary and intellectual tradition is Dr. Daveth Frost, former head of Holy Cross College in Barry. Daveth's doctoral work was in the field of Cornish studies, but having started academic life as a scientist, his interests range across the world of words, especially the Celtic and the medieval. Before we get started, though, I want to remind viewers that the Foundation Year program is brought to you by the Center for Applied Theology, and more locally by your Urban Abbey. The Center for Applied Theology was established to make opportunities for good theological study more widely available, while Urban Abbeys foster local engagement with the source material. Together, they seek to bring Christians together and encourage them in their faith while providing food for the intellect. If this idea interests you, I would ask you to visit the CAT website, that is www.appliedtheology.org.uk, and take out a membership that will enable you to participate actively in this venture. I also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just do a search for the Center for Applied Theology. But now, I will turn to Dr. Daveth Frost, to whom I'll also put the first question on the Odyssey. So Daveth, our students have been reading Homer, more specifically the Odyssey, and I think before I get into any particularly meaty questions, I would just ask you very briefly to describe for us the Odyssey. What is it? What sort of piece of literature is it? And what might we find inside its covers?
Well, I think you've been looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you've been looking at Genesis, and you've been looking at Exodus. So you've had a good start, because this is a very ancient form of literature, and it has grown up through storytelling. You could imagine this going back almost to the dawn of history, people sitting around campfires, telling stories, telling myths, and they often have a religious element. So that's fairly obvious when you're talking of something like Gilgamesh, where you're trying to explain the origin of the world. Or the same in Genesis, to some extent, you're telling the story of your people in Exodus, and the stories have accumulated with time, and you can see different elements in them. And it's no different really in the Odyssey. So you have a collection of stories, and they have been sewn together. We often say by someone called Homer. We have that from the ancients, just as we have Moses when we're talking about certain Old Testament stories. Homer is supposed to be a sort of blind poet. We might place him sort of 8th century BC, something like that. But, and possibly in the Aegean somewhere. But none of that is certain. We know that these stories were sewn together. You can see elements that have been drawn from different sources. They were a part of an oral tradition. So just as Shakespeare, when he's writing his plays, is drawing on stories that go back a long way before him. He's not making up the stories, he's putting his own spin on them. So this poetic tradition is doing the same with the Odyssey. And exactly like those other epics you've been looking at, there's a strong religious element. So we often forget this in modern times, because we tend to see the Greek myths as a sort of children's stories, or there used to be a television program where a talking dog introduced the Greek myths, and we see them as fantastic stories, and exactly the same way with Celtic myths. So when they were written down as stories, sometimes because, in the case of the Celtic myths, a little bit of embarrassment that they were the previous religion, if you like. So in Pedair Cainc y Mabinogi, the Welsh cycle, is portrayed as myths, but we can see from internal evidence that you're talking about gods, really. And of course, the gods appear all over the place in Homer. And there's kind of 2 or 3 levels in Homer. There's the story of the actual heroes, and then the gods are sort of motivating this behind the scenes. And so clearly there was some religious connection with these myths. They were, as poems, they were recited probably in chunks. And if there is a Homer behind the final version, he was sewing together quite a lot of them that would have been perhaps separate, and adding a level of meaning by doing that.
That's probably a good point at which I might cut in, just because first of all, I find what you're saying immensely helpful and fascinating, not least because you've mentioned a couple of times the sort of the religious implication or the religious import of these stories. And it seems to me, and I'm only talking off the top of my head now, but that's one of the features that might distinguish the Odyssey from the Iliad, only insofar as the Iliad has some kind of concern with history in a what we might call an empirical way. Now, I don't say that in any concrete sense, but whereas the Odyssey almost becomes utterly fantastical. Now, the Iliad's an epic poem, which is certainly mythical to some degree, but as I say, it purports to relate to these true events. The Odyssey, on the other hand, is quite fantastical. So how would you talk about truth when it comes to the Odyssey?
Yeah, I think it's quite good to start with the Iliad then, to say, well, the Iliad is the story of a war, of the Trojan War. We've all heard things about it. Helen of Argos is sort of carried off by Paris to Troy, which is where we would today call Turkey. But that was a kind of part of the Greek world in those days. So she's carried off, and her family and all their cronies are very annoyed by this, and they all jump into ships, and they're going to go and have a war on the city of Troy. The Greeks sail across, the Achaeans sail across, and they have a war at Troy. And we know it ends by them all climbing into a wooden horse, after lots and lots of battles and not actually getting there. They climb into a wooden horse, and then they get into the city, and then they sack the city. Now, is that history? Certainly there was a place, and archaeologists have tended to identify it as a hill called Hisarlik in what's now northwestern Turkey. And you can see from the topography that although it's a bit more inland now than it was, where the river was and where the sea coast was, where it seems to fit quite well. And excavations have occurred there. And they found different layers, many layers of the city as it was built and rebuilt over time. But the particular period that we're looking at, which we call the Mycenaean period, there does seem to have been some sort of city there, and it does look as though there was certainly conflict there. So you've got behind the Iliad, there's a certain amount of archaeology, and famously the German Victorian archaeologist Schliemann excavated it. He made a bit of a botched job in some ways, but he went round to other Mycenaean sites and found some extraordinary artifacts, gold masks and so on, which he linked with Agamemnon. He saw the Iliad as almost literally true, and he used it as his kind of Bible, a bit like Michael Portillo going around the railway system with his Bradshaw, and he went around that part of the world. So the Iliad says there should be a Mycenaean city here, let's dig, and he found lots of stuff. But subsequently, lots of questions have arisen about that. But I think there is no doubt that there was a Troy, and there were wars, so the Iliad, although it contains some rather wonderful stories like the Trojan horse, it seems rooted in some sort of history, even though it's very hard to reconstruct at this late date. Now, the Odyssey is a rather different thing, because at the end of the war, one of the Greek warriors, Odysseus, sets out home, and everybody gets home but Odysseus. Right. So he is delayed by a succession of mysterious encounters. He meets goddesses or semi-goddesses. He meets strange beasts, one-eyed children of other gods, Poseidon's son, Cyclops. So he meets wonderful, he goes into wonderful encounters. He meets a group, we call them the lotus eaters, and they're eating these sort of lotus fruits, and they were being drawn away, or maybe say a bit more about them later on, being drawn away from reality and into this kind of dreamlike world, and they didn't want to leave it. And going from island to island, having these, it takes years and years and years. And only eventually, after many years, does he come home. And so when he comes home, there's a denouement, but the Odyssey is not sort of talking so much about the particular war that he fought in, but this strange pilgrimage or journey he goes on through various aspects of life embodied through gods, goddesses, and so on. And he even goes into the underworld, into the place of ghosts and of death. He's on a strange journey that takes a long time, and eventually he finds his way home. So this is rather different from the Iliad, although both are epics and both contain mythology. There's some pretty full-on, some more spiritual stuff in the Odyssey.
Brilliant, thank you for that.
Okay, I'd like to jump in. And so you've been talking now a bit about the historical truth versus mythical truth, and sort of like the life lessons that come from that. Nowadays, though, we might see some of this, or it's argued quite often that that's quite a primitive way of thinking about things, and that we would be tempted to ask whether we can just explain things more rationally and scientifically now than in those times. So is there any value in the Odyssey and other myths for people of today, and especially from that question about the scientific and rationality kind of point?
Yes, that's a very good question. And well, I think we've already said, and you've alluded to there, that these myths were not just entertainment. They probably had a religious element, and they probably had an element of training young Mycenaeans for life. So you look at the character of Odysseus, and he's an absolutely amazing and wonderful character who embodies great qualities that a warrior needs. Okay, yeah, he is fierce and he's relentless at times, but he is also extremely patient and extremely subtle. And so the story is doing more than just giving you an account. So you could say, well, at least the Iliad tells us about what happened in this war our ancestors fought. Well, let's throw out this Odyssey because he's wandering around with these lotus eaters and one-eyed cyclopses and going into the underworld, and that's not scientific and it's all a load of rubbish. But what the stories are doing are telling us about hunting and fighting and loving and building societies and leading. And so we still do all these things, and we still need to learn how to do them well. So there is there's exactly the same elements in human life in all societies: Greek, Roman, Celtic, Norse, Indian, Mayan, South Pacific, and you name it. And even in the time of the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a lot in common with human beings. And these myths, yes, they are a story and they are literature, but they are also interwoven with religion, philosophy, and also how to live your life. They may have formed part of religious ceremonies. So what I would say is it still does have value, because we are still dealing with real people and situations. We're still dealing with fantastic beasts, actually, but perhaps within ourselves or among people. We're still dealing with the deep questions and metaphysical questions of life. But perhaps behind your question is another question, which is, are stories and myths good ways of communicating deep truths in the modern world?
Before we get on, can I just ask, so can we have use an example perhaps from the Odyssey for this? So if we picked out the story of the Cyclops or the Lotus Eater, whichever, and sort of said, okay. So what is the meaning coming across here, and what
so
meanings?
Take the Lotus Eaters, which it's the start of book 9, and so that is the book that talks about the Cyclops. I love the Cyclops story because it's the first bit of the Odyssey I ever came across. When I was aged 8, my teacher, Mrs. Timings, told us the story of the Cyclops. And we all rolled about with laughter because we had to write a little piece about it. And I can't remember if it was me or a friend talked about the pails of gigantic milk in the cave of the Cyclops. And it got us thinking, what is gigantic milk? We should have said gigantic pails of milk. But we said pails of gigantic, what is giant? So we got very, very excited by the story of Cyclops. But just before it comes in is this story of the Lotus Eaters. And just to remind people, they were among the Lotus Eaters who had no thoughts of making away with my companions, but gave them lotus to taste instead. Some of my men ate the honey-sweet lotus fruit and had no desire to retrace their steps and come back with news. Their only wish was to linger there with the Lotus Eaters, to feed on the fruit and put aside all thought of a voyage home. It's a wonderful story. It's about the attraction of losing yourself in some perhaps forbidden fruit. You could apply it in the modern world to being besotted with someone and forgetting your vocation in life, or even sort of use of drugs or those sort of things. There's a marvelous episode of Star Trek, which I'm sure is based on this, where they go to a planet and they're tempted just to stay there as a kind of, they're infected by some sort of plant spores, and they're all smiling at each other and being lovey-dovey and sort of yes man and all this sort of thing. And Kirk Captain Kirk is saying to them, oh no, we must leave. And, oh no, we can forget all our pain. And Kirk says, well, I need my pain. And so there's a lesson in this for us. It's not just a sort of airy-fairy story about people eating lotus plants. It's about how you can get distracted from your purpose by being drawn into a sweet, but essentially a byway where you forget the purpose of your life. Is that an example that shows how these stories might be applicable.
Yeah, it reminds me of I think J.R. Tolkien in sticking with the sci-fi theme there in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. He says that C.S. Lewis's aim is to sort of encourage sci-fi not being about just finding crazy technologies, but asking what these technologies mean for us to be human.
That's so right, because for example, in Perilandra, you are really, the whole novel is talking about the fall and redemption, and it's trying to explain these deep Christian ideas through sci-fi. And what Tolkien and Lewis thought, and Tolkien explained this very well in his essay on fairy stories, is that this is a dangerous form of literature. He calls it a perilous realm. The air that blows in that country is not easily described. It's a kind of metaphorical way of conveying truth, and it can be misused and it can be misunderstood. There are pitfalls and dungeons, as Tolkien says, but in essence, his argument is this: we are sometimes told a story about something, and we know it really happened, and that's a primary belief. But a well-told fairy story or myth draws you in because it feels true, even though you know that the Lord of the Rings is not about this world and it didn't actually happen in that form. There are elements of it that really strike to the core, and it helps you. And Tolkien would really stress this, that the idea that life is meaningless and then you die is rather exploded by these kind of stories. And people see these wonderful truths: cheating death, escaping aging and time, love that's eternal, where we don't break up, good triumphing over evil, these sort of things, victory being snatched from the jaws of defeat, sacrificial love, sacrificial heroism, bringing life out of certain death. These are the sort of things in these epics and myths. And people pay good money to watch and read these sort of stories. And why do they? Because they touch something very deep in people.
That's wonderful, and I'd love to explore this more with you actually. But before we do, so we've talked about myth, we're talking about the Lord of the Rings. So these stories, okay, we can't dispute they do contain human truths. However, are they accessible to modern people who live in a world where we are encouraged to be purely rational? These fantasy worlds where they talk of gods and mythical creatures and immortal beings, and worlds which are really quite implausible, do they have anything to offer modern people in a world where science is, in some ways, it's replaced religion for a lot of people?
Yes, and I'm not going to knock science. My first degree was in biology, and I am a scientist, as Father James said. But there are different types of truth, and we can too easily, in our modern, rather rationalist sort of way, dismiss these myths as what. In this discussion that I asked people to try and watch a dramatization of a famous discussion between Tolkien and Lewis in Oxford. Lewis suggests, well, yeah, they're lovely stories, and he really loved the myths, and he was particularly drawn to the Norse myths, which contain beautiful things. You know, when it rains, these are the tears of Balder, or Odin on the tree. These are profound, deep things, but aren't they just beautiful lies, says Lewis. And Tolkien comes back rather forcefully, saying, but it's almost that's the opposite of what they are. They are containing not just a type of truth, but the most primal truth. the most important realities cannot be conveyed. Cannot be conveyed by merely measuring things in the material world. So we use our five senses to observe things, and we come to scientific conclusions from them. We use mathematics, a very, very important tool, and so on. But Tolkien says, but there's more than this. There's much, much more than this. And you could be imprisoned if you thought there was only the material. And what these myths, so Lewis's point, myths are lies, though breathed through silver, is not right. You could almost say they're more true than factual explanations, not to deny the factual explanations. So there are people with Exodus who will say to you, aha, yes, well, perhaps the wind blew particularly hard that night and there was a path through the sand, or with Genesis, or these different stories, and the word Adam in Hebrew means mankind or man. So you can explain these things on a more rational way. But what Tolkien is saying is that there is a profound and deep way in which they're trying to convey things, very difficult things, that you can't really understand, almost like a fish trying to understand what it's like out of water, or Plato's analogy of the cave. You know, you see shadows projected on the wall by the fire. You try to work out what all this means, and that the myths are there to help you work out things that are beyond your five senses, beyond the prison, if you like, of the five senses. And this is why they're so important. So Tolkien's idea in that debate, which I think is really helpful when you're thinking about stories like the Odyssey, which have got apparently some quite crazy things in, he says, no, what these myths are doing is they're helping you go beyond the world you know to another world, which is really, really important for you. As spiritual beings. And this goes right back to prehistory, when shamanism was trying to help people to understand, if you like, the metaphysical, the supernatural side of it. Obviously, if you don't believe in the supernatural, this is not a very convincing thing to say. But clearly, behind these myths is the idea that there is more to life than merely the material world we see, important though that is, and important though science is.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be very careful, haven't we? And this is something that Tolkien really expounds on fairy stories. There's a tendency to conflate, quite incorrectly, escapism with desertion. Escapism being, as you say, wanting to consider what's outside of the prison of mere rationalism. If anything, I suppose desertion would be more accurately conflated with the lotus eaters. You know, the things that we drug ourselves with, whether that's video games, substances, whatever.
That's profound, Lucy. I think the idea that the real desertion is not to face these questions, and not at least to ask these questions about what might be beyond the things that we understand. So this is very important in science too, because if we just look at the world according to our five senses, we'd come to a lot of wrong conclusions. We didn't arrive at things like special relativity by observing the way things happen here. We have subsequently been able to back up parts of relativity from observation, but that's not how we arrived at them. It was rather speculative thinking, it was mathematics and those sort of things, because the universe is rather different from the way it looks on this small planet in our backyard. And you have to be imaginative. If you have to set sail with Odysseus to find, if you like, that the world is round, it's not flat.
Have I got time for one more question, or do I need to relinquish the mic now? I can't hear you, Father James, you're muted.
I think if you relinquish to Father Tom at this
No
stage.
problem. Thank you very much, Dr. Frost.
We'll raise it at the end.
Thank you, Lucy.
Hello, Dr. Frost. Yeah, interesting to hear you talk about these deep eternal truths, and it seems to me that you've admirably highlighted one side of the two-sided blade of rationalism, which is to, as it were, demythologize the myths, to talk about Moses crossing the sea as a kind of aspect of freak weather or something. But there's also an equal and opposite side, isn't there, of trying to translate the myths into modern language, almost to get a moral from the tale, or to extract a set of values from the scriptures or whatever it might be. And we can end up in a question of translation, as though we're really just asking the question, what is truth? Are we just taking these myths, and can we basically really just translate them into any modern day story? Do we need the myths themselves? Can they take us beyond rational truth into something more?
I think it is. I think it is possible to retell myths in modern ways. I think you make a very good point there about the other side of rationalism. I think it is true that attempts at criticism of texts like Genesis are not just sort of trying to demythologize. You can also be trying to say, well, what are the moral truths? But there's a danger of coming up with your own ideas of what it means and reducing it, because the complexity of the original story, even though you can't completely get into it, it's like reading a Chinese poem. There are all sorts of analogies in there and references you never get. But something of the atmosphere of what it's trying to say, that mysterious wind blows in from those far shores. But I think you're right to bring this down to the question: what is truth? I mean, is truth scientific truth? Is it moral truth? Well, and of course, this was Pilate's question in front of Jesus. So I don't think that's an accident that we're told that Pilate is sort of driven a bit to distraction. He says, what is truth? And so what Tolkien is arguing with Lewis on that night in Addison's Walk is that there are all these myths, and they all contain bits of truth, but as you say, quite hard to get at, quite hard to translate. But Tolkien is edging Lewis towards something that he believes very profoundly, that the life of Jesus Christ is the true myth. That's to say, for the first time, the story, the word, the mysterious story that people have been expressing in these myths is actually incarnated in our world, becomes real flesh and blood. And here is the true myth, says Tolkien. And if you can accept what he would call the big myth, the story of Christ, it's not just a question of, oh, well, yeah, then if you're crazy enough to believe the stories of Jesus, then you'll love all these other stories as well. It's not like that. It's really that the whole of history and of mythology, before and after Christ, are foreshadowing and aftershadowing this true myth. And so you can see in Norse myths, you can see in Welsh, in the Mabinogion and so on, you can see glimpses of what actually later came to be in the life of Christ, and subsequently too, just almost as though a kind of a bomb goes off in history, and the ripples go out from it before and after in time. So I think this is what, I mean, I know we're not primarily talking about Tolkien and Lewis, but I think this is what he's saying. He's saying that because God is the creator, it's a very special thing to undertake the work of what he would call sub-creation, and creating a mythical world such as we see in the Odyssey or in the Lord of the Rings. We do this because we are created. And so these types of stories, not just any old story, but these types of stories, which are kind of telling a deep truth through history, connect us with the way God communicates with us, the way revelation works. He communicates through the story of history and actually enters history. If you're a Christian, you believe he enters history. And then, in a way, the myth really breaks into the real world.
Yes, sometimes you hear people taking the fact that there are similarities between the Christian mythos and other earlier mythoi as a kind of evidence that Christianity is not true, as though any suggestions of shared truth must invalidate that truth. And yet it seems, of course, obviously, many early Christians, fathers and so on, read even the Iliad as Christian, as a Christian myth in its way, and saw a spiritual ascent in the Odyssey as well, Boethius particularly. So, yeah, I suppose we're coming to the connection between truth and goodness and beauty as something universal, but instantiated in the particularity of Christ. Is that sort of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, people often say things like all religions are the same under the surface, but they're different in externals. In many ways, the opposite is true. They've got a lot of, Muslims pray with beads, we pray with beads, and so on. There's a lot of externals in common, but some of the deep parts are different. But I think what you're saying is right, that somehow this profound, the myths, these profound stories, they don't invalidate our insights since the life of Christ, because sometimes people say, oh, well, Christmas, a load of nonsense because the Romans used to have a festival at this time and so on. But I turn that on its head. I think how very interesting that throughout history, people have celebrated the victory of light and life over the death and darkness of the winter. And this is very profound in us. And then we see it made flesh, as it were, and see just how profound and how relevant to our real lives some of these myths are. We have them. Tolkien would say they're kind of explained when the true myth walks among us.
Daveth, that was absolutely brilliant, and I really feel as if we could continue for hours as opposed to minutes. But to be fair to everybody present, I think that there will be people who are chomping at the bit to ask additional questions. And so I would just really throw it open to the floor and ask if anybody present has additional questions. If not, or at least if not so far, I know that Lucy had an additional question, and I suspect because I've just rudely cut off Father Tom, he may also have things he wants to follow up with. But if there are questions out there, can I get some indication from you, please? Okay, Lucy, do you want to start us off perhaps with the question you didn't get the opportunity to ask earlier?
Yeah, of course. And you actually, Daveth, you partially answered it when you were talking to Father Plant, but I just wanted to maybe just tease it out a little bit more. So in On Fairy Stories, Tolkien addresses the subject of myth, and he states that it does afford occasional glimpses of what he calls something higher. He doesn't really go into it in any depth, but he talks about, divinity, due worship. And I wonder, you did mention that we can see glimpses of that, or such glimpses rather, in the Odyssey. And And I have my own thoughts on this, and I've written a short paper about it, but I'd be curious to know what your perspective is. What are those glimpses that we see?
Well, that's great, Lucy. And I think we are, you know, Father Tom had partly hinted at this as well. Of course, on the surface of it, there's all sorts of higher truth, higher beings, religious beings in the Odyssey. And of course, it's being very, very driven by the goddess Athene. There's argy-bargy among the gods, as always in the Greek pantheon. So Poseidon's a bit cross and so on because of things that Odysseus has done to one of his offspring. But, and Zeus is presiding over all in a kind of wise way. So obviously on the surface of it, there's a lot of, if you like, higher power in there and talking about that. But I think it comes through as well in the actual stories. And we're talking earlier, of course, about stories like the Lotus Eaters. And I think that we sense in those stories some sort of moral or higher guidance. And there are beautiful things at the end of the Odyssey when, of course, Odysseus comes home to Ithaca, and his wife Penelope takes quite a long time to recognize him, and so do others. And there's all the suitors trying to marry Penelope and sort of take over Odysseus's mantle. And the way that is treated by Homer tears at the heartstrings, really. This is about it's a real homecoming. He wants to play with the idea of what is a real homecoming, where you really find your true home. And so you have, although there's the gods floating around and talking all sorts of kind of religious duties, which Odysseus feels very strongly, this element of religious duty, I think that the higher and deeper purposes of the Odyssey come through some of these very profound encounters. So when it gets to the point that he's the one, the only one who can draw the bow, and in the trial of the axes, and then when Penelope is saying, yeah, well, we've moved the bed, you moved the bed, you know, I made that bed, I know, only I was the only person who could have made that bed. It's a colossal thing. And finally, she recognizes him. And that sort of sense of sort of leaning, you imagine her sort of leaning her head against the wooden post, the thing, tears in her eyes. There, it is you. I've been hoping I would find you. I was hoping you would come home. And it really is you. I think this is the sort of thing Tolkien is meaning, really, that the sense of God has made us for himself. Our hearts are restless until they find their home in him. These things come through, I think, in the Odyssey, but not perhaps in an explicit way. Just as in The Lord of the Rings, you'll be hard-pressed. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of overtly religious stuff in The Lord of the Rings. Occasionally, the warriors will stand silently for a moment, and you know that something's going on there, but they won't say much about it. Or at a moment of great crisis, one of them might cry out to a supernatural being, but it's not very overt, but it absolutely shot through this higher world, is shot through it.
I know Father Thomas also has a follow-up question as well. I'm thinking he might need me to invite him to, yes, unmute.
Mute.
There we go.
Am I now unmuted?
You are Father Tom. We can hear you.
Not just miming like some sort of 19th century Parisian. Good. Yeah, on the subject of the higher spiritual powers, often in the Iliad, sometimes the Homeric world is criticised that the gods behave like humans and the humans behave like gods. But in the Odyssey, you've got the key character really of Athene all the way through. Glaucorpis Athene with her flashing eyes is the personification of wisdom, isn't she? The owl as her sacred sort of totem animal. I wonder to what extent you see this as a narrative of wisdom, and especially wisdom guiding to and from memory and forgetting. You've got the forgetting of the lotus eaters, the forgetting on the shores of Circe and Calliope as well. Memory, wisdom, and forgetting, and the relation of truth. Big questions. For a short time.
I think, Father Tom, I mean, I think you said it there. I mean, I don't really think I can add a great deal, except to say that the love of the Greek tradition for wisdom is profound. And, of course, topical in our day, the great cathedral of the Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, in Istanbul, it's interesting that that's the dedication of that great cathedral. And the Greek tradition appreciates and understands wisdom, just as, of course, there's so much wonderful wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and wisdom is personified in the Old Testament as well. And yes, there's some of the roots of this. This is exactly the same thing. There is such a thing as wisdom, and it is being perceived, even in these ancient times, in the stories of Athene. The human spirit recognizes as a certain personification of wisdom, and obviously, it is. I don't want to make a simple equation here with saying, well, O sapientia, Christ is our wisdom, because there are elements in what we read in the Bible about wisdom that also apply to Our Lady and also apply to the Holy Spirit and so on. It isn't a simple equation, but certainly this wisdom of Athene that is kind of behind and driving the tale is something very important, and I think you could lead us on that probably better than I could.
I doubt it. Thank you.
I just put out a last call for questions. Yes, G. I will just unmute you. Or ask you to
myself.
There we go.
So actually I have a question in terms of, if we kind of see like the Christ myth as the myth that sort of informs the other myths in a way, and we can see the Christ myth through the other ones. What do we do when we have a story that seems like completely antithetical to Christianity? Something like A Clockwork Orange or something like that. It's just amoral, but not bad as literature. It's like a good story, but doesn't seem to like help me understand Christianity.
No, I think it has to go the one way around. That's to say, Christ is the key that unlocks truth in other stories. And because God has spoken through history and through reality, as well as dimly through these myths. But I don't think it is impossible to see a certain beauty and truth, even in A Clockwork Orange. I wouldn't hold up A Clockwork Orange as a myth as such, but toward some of the tragedy at the end, the misunderstanding and the agony that he's going through, and I think there are deep things about the human spirit, even in that perilous tale, and where you find beauty and where you find truth. But you need to read it, I suppose. I find that Christianity does not cut me off from secular literature or from the great religions, the other great religions of the world. One of the things that it does for me is give me a sort of, if you like, a pair of specs, which suddenly makes what seemed blurred before clear, and I can appreciate. So you can get quite close, I think, to these myths and these other stories, providing you don't, as it were, abandon yourself to Stanley Kubrick's vision, but you remain rooted. I mean, Tolkien would say rooted in the true myth, and that doesn't mean these other stories are not accessible to you. Rather, you see deeper truths in them, I would say.
Yes, Daniel.
You were talking about the Odyssey and the idea of sort of the proper homecoming. Now, there's the famous Tennyson poem, Ulysses, which is about Odysseus. And I reread that, and it strikes me that his point is that there's something, certainly for Odysseus, about being restless and wanting always to keep going out on an adventure, rather than staying at home with Penelope and Telemachus. What the line is, I have it here. One of the big lines is, how dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life piled on life. What?
Yeah.
How would that? How is there anything you'd like to say about that in terms of the home? The idea of actually he comes home, but there's the prophecy at least that he will not stay home. He will go off on further adventures, and that he needs to do this.
Yes. I would say this reminds me of a poem by Alan Llewellyn Williams, where he has the phrase "Dychwel heb ddychweloedd," I think, or something like that. It was an unreturning return. And I think this is very true for the Christian, and it's modeled in a way by Odysseus, that yes, but there's an element of Odysseus is a bit like the Sleeping Beauty. It's not his fault that he's not dilly-dallying around. He can't find his way home. The gods are preventing him come home. They wait. Zeus presides over the meeting where they eventually say, okay, right, we'll let him come home now. And so it's not his fault that he's dallying on all these adventures. The gods, he needs to be on all those adventures. Just as the Sleeping Beauty, as it were, she needs to sleep for the allotted time. It's not that this one suitor's better at hacking away the briar roses or whatever. There's an allotted time. There's a journey you have to make before you get to that level of realization. Another example would be in Hermann Hesse's book Siddhartha, where Siddhartha goes on a long journey away from his initial spiritual journey as a sannyasi, and he loses a lot of what he had, but eventually comes back, and he's been on that journey, and his homecoming, but it is also an unreturning return. That's to say that, but there's a dynamic tension between you're always on an odyssey and you're always coming home.
Ask another question, follow up on that.
Yeah.
Firstly, could you say what was the name of that poet, or that person who wrote The Unreturning Return?
I think it was Alan Llewellyn Williams, but I may have his name wrong because I'm just going from memory, and we can correct this afterwards.
We'll do a fact check. The other, following on from that, you were talking about the gods in particular. Now, the gods seem to be the things that are moving the story along. At almost every point, it's whether it's in terms of Odysseus saying, whether it's in terms of Athene or whoever coming in and deciding what's going to happen next, or whether it's the way that the characters speak about these gods. They say, when something happens, it's the gods have put something in my heart, or the gods have moved me in this direction, or the gods have moved things in that way. Firstly, how much do you understand the classical folk would really engage with this sense of these gods and what they mean? And secondly, what does that say in terms of their understanding of their own agency in existence?
Well, I think back in time, back in history, they felt about these gods in very similar way as people do now about God or gods. And I don't think they were that cynical or dismissive of it. Some were, as some are today, and some found great spiritual sustenance in their religion, and they took it very seriously. I think if you read something like C.S. Lewis's Allegory of Love, he explains very well in the beginning there how in the later classical period, the gods began to be demythologized a bit, or to be seen in terms of as moral stories, and that process certainly went on. In the later classical period, they weren't perhaps seeing them as literally as initially, as has happened subsequently in our society. But I do think that people, I mean, it's a kind of a bizarre religious world. As Father Tom was saying, I think that you have the gods behaving sort of worse than the humans, and so that rankles with us. That's difficult for us to follow. But I think that nonetheless, in those days, where it was perhaps a darker religious vision, the gods could be very capricious. And I suppose they were deducing this from the nature of what they saw as providence. And it's only later that we're able to see in sometimes the most tragic events, and almost, particularly the crucifixion, we can see something other than what on the face of it is.
Am I going to let Daniel have finished with that final question, or is there anything else that people wish to raise? In which case, Daveth, I think that by this time you've earned yourself a drink at the very least, and would that I could be there. Oh, good, very good, very good. To buy it for you, but we'll have to do that another time. Thank you very much for everything that you've shared with us, and for guiding us through what is actually quite a pivotal moment in the Foundation Year program, certainly because of the pivotal nature of the literature itself. Very much appreciated, and you certainly lived up to what I was hoping you would. So thank you for that. And to the rest of you, I know that you will be following this up on Friday in a further discussion. And otherwise, we will see you all next week. Thank you, and God bless.